those of you that haven't met me before, I'm Helen Reid. I'm the Head of Operations here at Bristol Law Society. And as I said, I'm very happy to welcome you today to this webinar with Landmark Legal on an introduction to ESG, that's environmental, social and governance. I'm sure you know that, but just in case. I'm really pleased to welcome today's speakers, Sally Redman and Tom Venables, who are both senior consultants at Landmark Legal. Landmark, we do quite a lot of work with. They are great supporters of Bristol Law Society, and we've had, if you look at our archive of webinars in the past, you'll see we've done quite a lot on both environmental and sort of general property data search webinars and seminars too. So there's plenty of information as a wider group that they can give you, but as well as having data which is useful from the ESG perspective. I know that the group themselves are going through their own sort of ESG internal governance, aren't you, Sally? So I think there's that bringing that perspective as well to you today. But just a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Sally. Just to say that this webinar is recording today, and there will be some slides, and we'll send those to you at the end, along with a recording of the webinar for you to go back over, and also feel free to share that with relevant colleagues as well. And hopefully there'll be some useful information in there. In terms of any questions or comments, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the screen. There's a chat function as well, but the beauty about the Q&A is you can ask all those questions that you want to, and you can do it anonymously if you want. So no need to sort of stick your hand up and be embarrassed if there's a question you want to ask and you want to do that without saying who you are. But if you do want to tell us who you are and what, you know, why you're interested, then delighted to hear that too. So I think that's probably it. Just very quickly, just to say, if you look on our website, you'll find that this webinar today is a series of webinars that are coming during September and October. So please do take a look at the website. Have a look. There's all sorts of things. We've got another property related one on searches next week. We've also got information about retainers, recovery and billing, which is going to be great with Nick Lee of Paragon Solutions and ex-past president of Bristol Law Society. We've also got things on financial wellbeing and planning for progression from a career perspective. So plenty coming up in the next month. But enough of that. I think we've got a really jam-packed presentation today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Sally and Tom. And thank you very much for your time, Sally.
No problem. Thank you, Helen. Yes, so welcome to today's webinar on Introduction to ESG. I'm here with Tom Venables, who's Senior Consultant and Lead in ESG Consulting. He was heavily involved in the development of Landmark's new Risk Horizon platform and reports, and works alongside a team of environmental consultants to write and review our ESG reports. And I'm Sally, a senior consultant as well, working alongside with Tom, but also focusing on climate change and leading Landmark's net zero strategy. So today's agenda, we're going to go through an introduction to ESG. We're going to see how it's evolved since it was first introduced. Then we'll see how ESG affects the law firm and their clients. And then Tom will go through some solutions to ESG due diligence, and we'll provide a Risk Horizon demo. And then throughout the presentation, we'll provide examples of how clients are using our ESG reports. And then hopefully there'll be some time for question and answers. So if we just go through the introduction to ESG. So ESG stands for environmental, social and governance, and these factors are used to evaluate how far advanced companies and countries are in their sustainability. And there's always been a lot of focus on the E, which is environmental, but I've put some different areas on there on the slide which shows the areas that ESG covers, although it's not an exhaustive list. It covers quite a few of the topics. So E, environmental, is where a company can have a positive or negative impact on the environment. So this could be looking at what resources do they use to manufacture their products, Have their processes resulted in using hazardous waste, which potentially cause land and water contamination? Does the process involve a lot of waste? And how does that affect the natural ecosystem? Then S is looking at social, and this is looking at how a company's impact, again, both negative or positive, is on society. So we'll be looking at things like health and safety, working conditions for employees and supply chain, employee benefits, and also its impact on the local community. And then G is looking at governance, and this is looking at how companies are being run. So focusing on diversity and gender pay gaps, bribery and corruption, product quality, transparency and disclosure. Now, not all ESG issues are created equally, because they can change depending on the type of business, the industry sector that they're in, and also even the countries that they operate in. And so depending on the type of organization, there will be elements of ESG that are financially material to that business. So for instance, if there is a ban on fossil fuel cars, that's going to have more of an impact on a transport company than it will have on an accounting firm. And when we look for material risk factors, what we're looking for are any potential liabilities, such as remediation costs. We're looking at regulatory fines, any business interruption or product recalls, and then reputational risks. So if we just look at the development of ESG principles now, it first originated in 1999, when the first discussion took place on how to rally participants to support a global effort to highlight the social responsibilities of businesses. And in 2000, the UN Global Compact was first established, and this started out by Kofi Annan, who at the time was the UN General Secretary. And it was all about getting companies to become good corporate citizens and providing solutions to challenge globalization. So there were 10 UN Global Compact principles, and these were all around human rights, labour issues, the environment and corruption. And in 2004, he wrote to 50 major financial institutions in the world, trying to get them to integrate ESG into their capital markets. And with the next development, there was a report entitled Who Cares Wins? And the report highlighted that incorporating ESG factors in capital markets made good business sense, especially for the longer term, and led to more sustainable markets and better outcomes for societies. And if we just go to the next slide, Tom, thank you. In 2005, the UN Environment Programme sponsored a report headed up by law firm Freshfields to look at ESG in the financial markets. And the conclusion was that conventional investments just focused on financial performance, often looking at short-term performance. And there was an increasing need for investment communities to look at ESG and financial performance. And these two reports started off another major development, which was backed by the UN, which was the Principles for Responsible Investments. And Kofi Annan wrote again to many of the financial institutions across the world, and around 100 joined up to that. And now there are, I believe, 12,000 businesses that have signed up. And then in 2009, we had the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. And in 2019, we then had the European Green Deal, which was driven by the European Commission. And they had set very challenging targets to make the EU net zero, climate neutral by 2050. And one of the ways that it intended on doing that was by using the EU sustainable finance, which was all about shifting private funds into companies that helped with that transition towards net zero. And so as an investor, you wouldn't really want to invest in a company that was focused on fossil fuels. You would be investing really in companies such as renewable energy companies. And if we just go through the development of ESG risk standards now, with the standards, they're crucial because they provide meaningful and comparative data. And over the years, there have been a number of global ESG standards, and they've evolved over time. And initially, they were competing, but over time, they've now started to converge with each other. And some of these standards are considered to be more general in their applications, whilst others are more industry or sector specific, looking for real estate or particular infrastructure sector. And this slide really just shows some of these different standards that are out there. So the first one is the Global Reporting Initiative standards, which are divided into three parts. We have universal standards, sector standards, and topic standards. The universal standards set the scene and include how do we disclose information and what constitutes materiality. The sector standards are detailed requirements for disclosure for specific industry sectors. I believe that 40 are planned, but to date only 3 have been produced, and these are on oil and gas, coal, and the recent one has been agriculture and fishing sectors. And then as part of this, we've got the topic standards, which set out clear instructions for making development disclosures. And there are 32 of these in total, and these range from economic performance to customer privacy. Then the next are the SASB standards. These are Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, and this was set up in 2011 and is based on industry-specific requirements. And there are currently 11 sector categories, and within each of those sector categories, there are also a number of industries within them, giving a total of 77 industries. And so, for example, if you had a sector that's headed as technology and communications, within that sector, there will be an industry called software and IT services. So each industry has their own industry standard, and that's been developed over time through consultation with investors and industry. Then after that, there was the International Integrated Reporting Council, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is SASB. Both of those officially merged to form the Value Reporting Foundation, and that occurred mid-2021. And by the end of 2021, we had a formation of yet another organisation, which was the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is number 3 on the slide. And this combined the Value Reporting Foundation and what was previously known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. And the aim of this was to develop a global baseline standard for sustainability disclosures by consolidating and building upon those initiatives. And then finally, we have the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, which is known officially, that's how we name it, is GRESB. And this was founded in the Netherlands in 2009. And this was used by pension managers, and it was developed as a set of standards and assessment for real estate owners, managers and developers. And these were used primarily by property managers to measure the current environmental footprint of their portfolio, and also to prepare for the effects of climate change. So that's an overview of the different of how ESG is developed over time. And I just wanted to go through just some of the ESG issues that we've seen in the newspapers over the last few years. So there's quite a few on here. I'm just going to go through a few of those. So we've got Boohoo, which was in the news fairly recently. They are an online fashion retailer who was exposed for not assessing the working conditions of their supply chain. And it was revealed that workers in Leicester were being paid less than the minimum wage. And then the other one, which is well known, is the gender pay gap from the BBC, when that was published in 2017. And that caused a big outcry, and lots of companies then being asked to look at their gender pay gaps. And in 2018, the government introduced compulsory reporting for the gender pay gap for organisations with over 250 employees. And then if I just go through some of the trends, these are some of the things that we're seeing at the moment. A big one is on climate change policy and how net zero is being incorporated into companies now, where we're having to look at our carbon footprints. And alongside that, we're looking at the supply chains and seeing how resilient they are, and what their net zero strategies are and how that impacts on our company. Since COVID, we've also been looking at how the pandemic affects businesses and how resilient they are. And then also, again, we're still seeing lots of new innovation in ESG standards and application of ESG. And Tom will go through one of our products that we have. And with that in mind, I'll pass you over to Tom.
Thank you, Sally. So I'm just gonna take this forward. So yeah, that was a great overview of the background there and kind of intro into some of the key themes that are central to, I guess, how law firms are approaching ESG, not just in terms of due diligence, but also in terms of how they're managing their own operations. There's a few things just to cover with that. So what is that current approach of the law firm in terms of ESG? So as ESG has become established in recent years, it's been adopted and integrated by a large number of law firms, as you'll probably know. And broadly, this is separated into two general areas, which I'll share on the next slide. So the extent of how far along some firms are with their ESG journey will be determined normally by the size of the firm, but also by the markets across which they operate, what their specialisms might be in terms of their practice areas, and the specialist lawyers they have within the firm. So some firms, as you know, will have dedicated ESG teams. That's a fairly recent development, whereas other firms might rely on individual lawyers across different practice areas on specific ESG topics. So you might have an environmental lawyer within the firm that takes an interest or a focus on climate change or pollution, or you might have a health and safety lawyer who's focusing on workplace accidents, for example. So just to kind of split it out a little bit further. So as I said, we've got the ESG Council side of things, and then the ESG operations. So principally, we split it into these two areas. So in terms of ESG Council and ESG practice areas, that would be advising commercial clients across either national or global jurisdictions, and that can be on a range of matters, some of which are on the slide. So for private equity, for example, you might require ESG risk assessments. You might be working on ESG program design, advice on company reporting, or particularly disclosures if they're a publicly traded company, or board counsel as well at the top level of a business. So outside of that, it could also mean assisting public companies with their ESG strategy, or indeed the implementation of policies as well. So looking across at the other side of the slide, if we look at ESG operations, in terms of what law firms are doing for their own kind of sustainability targets, there might be specific areas of focus within a firm, such as reducing its carbon footprint across its offices, or they might be involved in pro bono work on issues such as human rights. And we've actually worked closely with a few firms in the last sort of 6 to 12 months, establishing what different global warming scenarios might look like for the firm in terms of risks and opportunities. And also a number of firms, as you're probably aware, have committed publicly to net zero as well. So that all falls under the sort of ESG operations umbrella as well. So just to bring it back to ESG due diligence, that could be either for mergers and acquisitions or private equity advisory, or just generally assessing risk for corporate clients. There's a whole range of issues that could be relevant to the particular company that you're looking at. And again, this is a kind of a snapshot of the main ones. Again, it's not an exhaustive list, as Sally mentioned when she shared a similar slide earlier. But the kind of breadth of issues that you might have to tackle or look at in terms of ESG is pretty substantial. So how do you go about addressing this in terms of understanding what the risks are for your particular business or target? And how do you do this in a sort of systematic and repeatable way? So you make sure basically none of these issues are missed at any stage of the due diligence process. So yeah, you could be looking at a specific company in the software and IT sector, for example. You're going to have a different set of issues to consider against a chemical manufacturer. So, you know, what are the things out there to help with understanding what the key material issues are for a particular business? And there's actually quite a few now. There's a number of tools and software solutions that have come to the market. Large number of them designed not just to kind of capture metrics or lifecycle management of ESG kind of practice, but also for ESG due diligence. And that's what I'm going to share with you in the next couple of slides. I'm going to jump onto a platform demo and walk you through the Landmark ESG Risk Horizon platform. So just to introduce that a bit further, as Sally kind of mentioned again earlier on in the presentation, Landmark's created the Risk Horizon ESG screening platform, and we have that available as an annual license, but we also produce due diligence reports for law firm clients as well. So primarily those reports are designed for corporate diligence. So again, it's used to frame and focus the due diligence for a client. So whether that's mergers, acquisitions, private equity, investment activity, or corporate advisory for things like gap analysis, the reports are being designed to assist with that. So they're screening level reports, and they present the key risks in an easy to kind of digest and understand format. So that's what we're looking at on the screen there. So the front page of our ESG screen report is on the right-hand side. And those reports are based on a profile using a combination of data sets, which I'll talk you through when I move on to that part of the presentation. And these cover industries and geographies, so where the company operates, as well as the kind of sectors and industries in which that company sits as well. So our reports are created using the Risk Horizon software, and they're underpinned by the SASB standards. So I know Sally did a good overview of SASB a few slides ago, and they'd actually established a pretty helpful data set on industries by 2018, which is one of the most comprehensive ones that was available at the time. And that's the kind of data standard and data framework that we've adopted into the platform. And this allows us, as I mentioned before, to kind of follow a repeatable and standardized process and approach, and using that SASB materiality sort of matrix and map that they've created in their IP and data as well. So aside from the kind of underlying data that's in the platform and that goes into the reports, we also have an additional layer of information analysis that we provide, and that's sort of sector-specific ESG management questions, and we look to source information from publicly available sources, and that goes into the review and the management analysis that we put together in the report, which I'll show you. So, as I said, on top of the kind of risk topic data that sits within the platform, so from SASB and a range of other data providers, we actually go out and look at the company that we're targeting, that we're doing the assessment on, in terms of disclosures that they've submitted. So if it's a publicly traded company, we'll go through their annual reports or sustainability disclosures. We'll do a review of the company website, and we'll try and capture information about what the company is kind of divulging about its own operations in terms of ESG. So on top of that, we will also then look externally. So we'll look at you know, anything that's made its way into the press. So we heard about Boohoo earlier, but any other kind of negative press stories that are published on kind of paid media sites. So we've got Financial Times, the Times newspaper, anything that's kind of verifiable source, we will look to add that information into the report as well. And then separate to that, we'll also look at external databases and try and identify any kind of violations, whether that's pollution incidents, health and safety, fines. We could identify product recalls or human rights accusations, depending on the company. And that's the information that we'd look to add to the report as well. So at this stage, I'm just going to switch this to the platform. So if you just bear with me. Hopefully you'll be seeing my screen. Has that come up?
Yes, it looks
yep,
good.
Perfect. Thank you. And so, yeah, this is our risk horizon platform, as I described, and this is what we use to produce our ESG screening level reports for law firm clients. So it's been developed in conjunction with Anthesis, who are global leaders in sustainability, and we released this at the beginning of last year, and we're working closely with a number of law firms and a couple of private equity customers as well. So in terms of our ESG screen assessments, I'll walk you through the kind of process in terms of how we approach this. So essentially, this is the main feature of the platform, is the company assessment. And you work through a series of stages along this tube map to populate areas of the assessment that will then output into a PDF report that then we send on to the client. So if I just add in an example, so if we look at Rio Tinto, an example, basically what this section of the assessment does is allow us to obviously select our target and also add in any additional detail to that particular company in terms of the context of the report. So if we've identified our company we're running the assessment on, so as I said, this example will be Rio Tinto, the mining conglomerate, we could add in their headquarters, number of employees, website URL, and a brief description of the company. And that information then would be kind of transposed into the report as well, which I'll show you at the end. But all we need really is the company name. So once we've got that, we can move the assessment forward. We have an API that's kind of plugged into the back of the platform, which utilizes a database of 80,000 company names. And if the company is a match within the database, it auto assigns a primary SASB industry to that particular company. So we're not restricted. So if it is a smaller private company, we can still do the report. We just have to manually profile the industry for that particular company. And this is kind of what it looks like. So we've got our primary industry for Rio Tinto PLC, which is metals and mining, and that sits within the extractives and mineral processing sector. So if we're looking at a different company, maybe a company that had multiple business areas or segments, we could actually add in up to 3 additional industries for that particular company. And we could do that through selecting from these drop-down sector headings here. So maybe if we were looking at other aspects of what Rio Tinto did, or if they were expanded into, say, oil and gas, we could select any one of these relevant industries as well as a data point for this particular assessment. So if we're happy with our primary standard, or if we don't want to add any additional industries in, we can then move the assessment forward. And what this will do is return a set of material risks for that particular industry. So that's what we're looking at here. So we've got obviously industry in the box up there that we've selected, then underneath we've got material risks. So these are the key material issues based on the industry profile for metals and mining. So it's color coded, and we have the environmental issues in green, the social issues in red, and the governance risk topics in blue. So instantly you're kind of getting a sort of a framing of what the key issues are likely to be based on that industry. And that's presented very quickly within the platform. So obviously looking at material risks by industry is only part of the equation. So the second part would be for us to add in operating locations. So if I start to build this view with a few of the Rio Tinto locations, I won't add all of them in because I think they're present in about 30 or so countries, and we'll be here all afternoon if I just add in some of them. what this starts to do then is sort of build out the footprint of the company. So as I said, going beyond what the industries cover, but also what the issues are at a country level. So I think I'll just add one more in. And then what this starts to do then is build that sort of picture of combining industries and then those geographies. So as I said, there's about 30 or so, and there's no cap on the number of countries. So if you're looking at a massive multinational, you can add as many of those countries in. Likewise, if we're doing this assessment for you know, a UK only or a European based business, then that's fine as well. We can just restrict that to the geographies in which they have those physical assets. So if I just scroll down, if we look at the geographic comparison first of all. So what we're looking at here is a set of data scores for the risk factors that are relevant to this particular company. So for each of these risk factors, we have underlying data sets that sit behind the platform. And these are from a range of data providers. So we use data from organizations like the World Bank, the World Resources Institute. Just to highlight this one, water stress, we use the Aqueduct 3.0 dataset, which is from the World Resources Institute. And depending on that data source, some of them are kind of annual indexes or annual reports. And we basically take that data and normalize it into our scoring system. So for example, the water stress one, I think they have a 0 to 5 rating system. We've used that data and we've input that into our 0 to 10 scoring system here. So that's what we're seeing. So we've got the number, and then it's color coded in terms of the risk as well. So our scoring system, so 0 to 2 is low risk, which is the dark green, 2 to 4 is low to moderate, which is the lighter green, moderate risk, 4 to 6 in yellow, moderate to high in orange, which is 6 to 8, and then 8 to 10 is high risk, which is represented in the red. And those are the data scores there. So I did add in the kind of, I guess, least performing locations of Rio Tinto's operations. So we've got quite a few reds here, quite a few high risk outputs for these risk factors. And yeah, as you'd expect in some of these developing countries and more established ones as well. But what this kind of gives you is a flavor of what's happening at a kind of country level as well as the industry. So if I just scroll up, we have the other side of that, which are scores assigned to the materiality of the risk factor at an industry level as well. So these scores are from SASB, and these are basically ranking how material these risk factors are to a metals and mining business in terms of financial impact, so financial materiality. So we've got quite a few moderate to highs, a few moderates, and then one low to moderate there. So it's essentially scoring within this particular industry standard. These are obviously the key issues, and then in terms of significance, those which are in orange would be those that are most significant. And then the inherent risk is basically, it's a calculation which looks at the top 5 at-risk countries, summarizing the data that sits behind the platform. So at this stage, it's not looking at what Rio Tinto is doing to manage its ESG risk, that comes later, but it's giving you a view of sort of based on the data, unmanaged raw risk, it's moderate to high. So if I just move this forward, the next stage of the assessment is to input responses to these generated management questions. So what the system will do is it will identify the key risk topics that have been presented, and it will present ESG management questions that target policy statements and mitigation for each of those risk topics. So as we're seeing here, we've got 16 due diligence questions for under the environmental kind of bucket, 7 for social, and 4 for governance. And these will change depending on the target that we're looking at. So if we were to look at a software and IT business, obviously you'd expect to see more social, more governance questions perhaps than environmental. So this will adapt to the assessment that you're doing. And then how we go about fulfilling this is answering these questions, as I said, from those internal and external data sources. So annual reports on top of the kind of keyword searches and looking at databases, you know, for things like contamination, pollution, and other resources. So that's kind of how we approach it, and we'd add our detail in here, and then this gets captured and output into the PDF report as well. So just to take this forward, again, we have different levels of assessment that we can do. So that's one stage of a report, a screening level report, and we can actually do a more detailed ESG maturity review if requested, where we'll actually fill out a checklist. So this can be either through a data room review, or we can actually download this and send it on to either our law firm clients to send on to their client, or if we've got permission to, we can actually send this directly to our law firm end client, and they can fill this out. We can then, once it's returned, we can then drop the file into this box here and actually populate answers of the checklist into this system for us. So if I just start to explain what this is showing, it's a set of comprehensive kind of questions, so more detailed, more comprehensive than the management questions. I think there's about 115, 120 questions in total. And what this will allow you to do is start to build an ESG maturity score of that particular company. So if I start to answer some of these, what this will do is start to show on this rev counter here. So as we're answering these, yes, no, or no evidence, depending on how we're responding, it will either add a point to the rev counter or it won't add a point. And by the end of the assessment, you'll have an overall percentage score somewhere on this scale here. So we've got market leading 85% and best practice at 75%. So if you're looking at a company that's doing things pretty well and managing its ESG risks, competently, you'd expect to see them at this end of the sliding scale. We do have different levels to this as well. So if you didn't want to do the full maturity review, you could actually just stick with the base key management indicator questions, and that's kind of ranked or scored, sorry, out of 25. And then finally, the last sort of stage of the assessment is recommendations. So what this does, again, it goes back to what the platform has presented us in terms of the key issues and what the data points are saying. And it highlights the top 5 and gives you generic recommendations against those risk topics. So again, when we're doing this for our clients, we will amend these to reflect the analysis and information that we found. So for example, if, from our research, we found that the company is monitoring its air quality and has abatement and emissions targets in place, then we will obviously change to reflect that. Also, on top of the top 5, we can actually add in up to 5 additional issues. So again, from that analysis, if we've identified that it's been specific human rights accusations against the company, we could add in the human rights recommendation. So we'd select that, it would come up, and then we would amend this again to reflect the information that we found and the recommendation in terms of what it's telling you to do for further actions. So that's the kind of process of the assessment. And then hopefully this is going to share as well. I'll just very quickly share the report before we move on to some questions. If I just stop sharing this very briefly and then reshare. Hopefully you should now see a PDF report as well, if that's come up.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So yeah, this is the output of a full ESG screen. So with that maturity review, with the rev counter, so the checklist completed, and then this is what we're providing for clients. So all the information, key information on the front page, our top 5 risks, ESG risk topics, our top 5 at-risk countries, the overall inherent risks, so that unmanaged sort of raw risk rating, and then crucially the ESG maturity score, so the management score for that particular company based on the checklist answers. The key information that we added at the start of the assessment is shown on the right hand side, so just a description of the company, key details including the location, a number of employees. Then we have the executive summary. So again, this kind of just highlights that score in terms of how that's been generated, what key policies have been identified, or if there's any missing, and the kind of status of the questions. So how many of those management questions have been completed, and the checklist questions as well. So it kind of gives you all that key information on this page. Then we have the key recommendations, so the last section of the platform that I just showed you, to do with those risk topics, and then the additional 5 that have been user added. So that's all summarized there. Some ESG management advice as well in terms of recommendations and next steps based on that checklist response. Report detail section, so very helpful map here with all your operating locations, as well as 2 additional data sets that go into the PDF report. So any countries that your company has operations in that have sanctions against them, so they will be visible here. And then also we have a pandemic preparedness data set, which is based on the Global Health Index. So again, that just splits up preparedness into 3 categories, and that also is shown in the PDF report here. And then on top of that, you'll get your report detail. So this is content from SASB in terms of that particular industry that we've selected, so metals and mining, and then into our risk assessment. So the scores for the combined key impacts, the relative country risk, and then overall risk assessment and risk matrix. So you've got all your country locations, and then your risk topics here by industry as well. And then in terms of the information review, so those management questions that we've answered, this tends to be the sort of level of detail that we add in. So we're looking at sort of summarizing the key information, presenting the headlines against these risk topics, and this is how that information is presented. So those to do with the top 5 risks are highlighted in this sort of shade of pink here. And then the other key questions that have been answered also fall in underneath. So this is the information, as I said, from the company website, from our external database searches, from anything that's kind of made its way into the news cycle. This is where we're adding that information to and how it's presented. And then finally, the last section is the raw data from the checklist. So obviously we've got our maturity section here. So again, we've got the rev counter and then those answers to the checklist with any notes that we've added to the platform as well in terms of how we populated this in terms of key information. And then finally, the back of the report, you'll have a link to references and resources. So if we've used, I don't know, the HSE database for accidents as a resource, and we've identified some information there, that will be in here with a hyperlink so that those that receive the report can actually go to the original source of information as well to kind of look at that. And that's the PDF report. So I think that's kind of wrap things up in terms of the platform demo and an overview of the report. And I think now we've got some time for any questions.
No, well, thank you, Sally and Tom. That was really really interesting, and I have to say, I mean, just looking at just how extensive sort of, the things that come under those ESG categories are, it's quite something, isn't it? And I can imagine that it's a lot of firms, I imagine, have been doing something, I guess possibly falling into that sort of old CSR category, and things will have been done, but I get the sense that ESG is very much sort of I don't quite mean a reinvention, but is kind of the modern way of looking at that. And certainly I get a sense that whereas in the past it might have been enough when you're talking to people to show them your policies on things, but now there is very much a data-driven aspect to that, and you have to evidence that you're doing it, not just that you've written about it.
Exactly, yeah, that's a key distinction. So it's the measurement of those policies and your sustainable performance, which is, I guess, the big key thing. Yeah. CSR, before, I think you could get away with saying we're doing X or Y, but if you're not backing it up with evidence and metrics and measuring that sort of performance, then that's obviously where ESG kind of comes into its own.
Yeah, and I guess again for a lot of people, some elements are probably quite easy to determine by metrics, aren't there? And others are a little bit more ambiguous, I guess. And it's just sort of working out a way to measure those internally. But certainly from a corporate perspective, and I thought the Risk Horizon report, I mean, the sort of information that's included in that is incredibly extensive, isn't it?
Yeah, we've had some good feedback, and yeah, it's being used on corporate transactions for a number of firms. So yeah, we're pleased with where it is.
And do you get the sense that that is now accelerated, and sort of, I'm guessing that, you know, has there been, I'm just wondering whether the pandemic again has kind of increased that that acceleration of looking at these kind of you know, these social aspects as well.
Absolutely, I think that's a really good observation. And yeah, it's post-pandemic, yeah, social issues have definitely come to the fore. I think before that, obviously climate change was quite a well-discussed topic, and obviously some other environmental issues, but definitely since COVID, you know, how companies are treating their employees, you know, supply chain issues, these are all things that have really come to the fore with it, and obviously they are all central to ESG as well. So we're seeing a lot more of that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm involved in a number of the law firms, and, you know, including some of the people who are on here, and we've sort of brought some people together to start sharing, and mostly on probably their internal sort of net zero journey. And, you know, it's really interesting to see, you know, sort of the metrics that come out of that, and the emissions, and also, you know, just how far it can go. You know, I think lots of people are measuring their supply chains, aren't they, and their own sort of internal metrics around buildings and, you know, electricity and, you know, light bulbs and all of that sort of thing. But I think there is that extra element for what we do as a sector, is, you know, almost the effect of our advice and what that has further down the chain. I suspect that's something that is really quite difficult, and you know, one that law firms are going to probably have to grapple with at some point as well. But yeah, so that's enough from me. I know we've certainly got one question. If anybody else has got any questions, please do put them in the Q&A or into the chat, or just comments quickly. We'd love to pick up on that. But Darcy, I know earlier on, I think in Sally's presentation, you asked the question, where can you find industry-specific standards for law firms, and what would that come under? Is that something that's out there in the world at the moment?
Yeah, if you use the Salisbury standards, there is a sector under services. So one of the industries would be professional and commercial services, which is looking at legal advice that you provide your clients. So I would use that. And then we're working with a number of law firms also on CDP, so the Climate Disclosure Project, and helping them with their disclosing all of their carbon emissions.
That's great, fantastic. I know also just in terms of in contracts and things, there's also the Chancery Lane project, isn't there, as well, which people might want to take a look at as well. Any more questions from anybody? I know that there's obviously a lot of information in there, and we're going to sort of send that on to those of you who are on the call, also those who have registered and haven't made it, and more generally. But I mean, I'm sure Sally and Tom, if people have got questions, or if they think that this is something that might benefit their teams or firms, that you know, we'll include your details in the email, and I'm sure you'd be delighted to talk to people.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, happy to help.
So any last minute questions from people? I think that's always a sign that you know, there's lots of information, and either you've answered everything, or people are completely bamboozled and they need to get away.
I was going to say, I hope it's not the latter, but yeah, I appreciate went through quite a lot there, especially with the, you know, the intricacies of the platform, and, you know, materiality and data and all those things. So absolutely,
I mean, I certainly see the benefit of that, and I think, you know, perhaps it's something that, you know, our corporate lawyers you know, might be interested in exploring more, because that seems certainly very relevant to the work that they're doing at the moment. And as you say, it's the first time I've walked through that, and there's a huge amount of information there for people to act upon, isn't there?
Yeah.
So well, I think that's it. No further questions. But Tom and Sally, thank you very much indeed for your time today. Really fascinating, both introduction from you, Sally, and in terms of where people can go for extra resource, and Tom, you know, it's great to see the risk horizon and what that can offer, you know, law firms, if you know, they would help find that information helpful for their clients in some of those transactional work that they're doing. So for those of you who've attended today, thank you very much indeed. As I say, the information is going to wing its way to you probably later today, if not tomorrow morning. So please do share that amongst your teams, and encourage them to take a look at the webinar and the information. And again, if you do want any further information from Sally and Tom and Landmark generally on the products and services they can offer them, you know, their contact details will be on there, but also feel free to contact us as well. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar.